The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of scarred wood and strained leather, finally juddered to a halt, sighing dust like a dying man's last breath. Elara clutched the worn edges of her reticule, its meager contents a testament to a life distilled into bare necessities and a single, fragile hope. Inside, a letter, its creases softened by countless readings, promised a new beginning in a place called Redemption Gulch, a name that seemed to mock the parched, unwelcoming landscape stretching before her. Jedediah Roth, the sender, had painted a picture of modest prosperity and companionship, a haven from the shadows of her past. She had offered, in return, her willingness to be a good wife, a diligent partner. Her photograph, she knew, was old, taken in softer light, before certain hardships had etched their stories onto her face, before the sun had kissed her skin quite so deeply on the long journey west. A knot of apprehension tightened in her chest, a familiar companion, yet today it wrestled with a desperate tendril of optimism. She descended, her boots sinking into the fine, powdery dirt of what passed for a main street. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more a collection of weathered buildings clinging stubbornly to the unforgiving earth, a raw gash in the vast, indifferent expanse. A few faces turned, incurious or openly assessing. Then she saw him, a man of middling height, dressed in a store-bought suit that looked stiff and unfamiliar on his frame, standing near the rough-hewn porch of the general store. His gaze, initially expectant, swept over her, and then it faltered, snagged, a flicker of something, confusion, then a dawning, ugly realization, crossed his features. This had to be Mr. Roth. You are Elara Vance?" he asked, his voice, which in his letters had seemed so reassuring, now held a tremor of disbelief that quickly hardened into something else. Elara managed a nod, her throat suddenly as dry as the dust swirling around her ankles. "Mr. Roth, I am pleased to finally make your acquaintance." She offered a tentative smile, the kind that had been practiced in the dim light of countless boarding-house rooms. His eyes, pale and unsettling, raked over her, from the dark coils of her hair escaping her modest bonnet to the hue of her skin, a warm brown that spoke of a heritage more complex than he had evidently anticipated. The anticipation on his face curdled into a mask of distaste, then outright anger. This is an outrage," he sputtered, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the few loiterers and shopkeepers. "A deception." Elara recoiled as if struck. "Sir, I do not understand." "You do not understand." Roth's voice was now a sneer, loud enough for all to hear. "The advertisement was for a respectable woman, a suitable woman. There was no mention of this." He gestured vaguely, contemptuously, at her person. "My advertisement specified certain qualities. This is not what I was led to expect. Your photograph, madam, was a falsehood." Heat flooded Elara's face, a burning shame mixed with a rising tide of indignation. "My photograph was taken some years ago, it is true, sir, but it was an honest likeness then, as I am honest now. My heritage is mixed, but my character is sound. I offered no deception." Her voice trembled, but she met his gaze, praying he would see the truth, the earnestness in her eyes. "Character?" Roth laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "I see all I need to see. This town, this life, it requires a certain purity. You have misrepresented yourself, grievously. I will not be made a fool of. The arrangement is null and void." He turned on his heel, a dismissive flick of his hand. "You will not be staying with me. You are not welcome." The words, brutal and public, hung in the air, each one a stone cast. The onlookers, silent predators or merely indifferent witnesses, offered no comfort. The stagecoach driver, impatient to be on his way, was already urging his horses. Elara stood alone, her small valise at her feet, the promises of the letter turning to ash in her heart. Redemption Gulch, it had offered none. The stagecoach lurched forward, its departure sealing her abandonment, leaving her stranded in a tableau of public humiliation, the vast, empty sky, a merciless witness to her shattered hopes. The dust settled, and with it, a profound silence. Ilara felt the stares of the townsfolk like physical blows, some curious, some cold, a few openly scornful. No door opened to her, no voice offered solace. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the harsh, unwritten codes of this fledgling settlement. Her rejection was a spectacle, and now the show was over, the audience dispersing, leaving her to the desolation that was both within and all around her. For a long moment, she could not move, her feet rooted to the spot where her dreams had so decisively crumbled. The sun beat down, and the wind, a dry, mournful sigh, whispered through the gaps in the buildings, carrying with it the scent of dust and a deep, abiding loneliness. With a will she did not know she possessed, Ilara finally bent and picked up her valise. To stay there, a monument to Roth's cruelty, was unthinkable. She began to walk, with no destination in mind, only a desperate need to escape the prying eyes, the silent judgment. She moved towards the edge of the town, where the buildings grew sparser, giving way to the scrub and rock of the open land. Each step was an effort, her body leaden with despair, her spirit bruised and raw. The landscape was a mirror to her soul, stark, unforgiving, offering no apparent comfort. She passed a livery stable, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air, but the man working there merely stared, his face a stony mask. A dog barked, then slunk away. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting it in hues of violet and bruised orange, a deeper chill set in. She had no food, no water beyond the last sips in her canteen, and nowhere to lay her head. The vastness of the wilderness, which from the stagecoach had seemed a promise of open space, now felt menacing, an enormous mouth ready to swallow her whole. She found a small alcove between two large boulders, partially hidden from the track leading out of town, and sank down, the rough stone cold against her back. The tears she had held back finally came, silent and hot, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She wept for her lost hope, for her foolish trust, for the simple dignity that had been so cruelly stripped from her. How long she sat there she did not know, hunger gnawing at her stomach, the cold seeping into her bones. The world had shrunk to this small, miserable patch of earth. From the periphery of Redemption Gulch, where the last vestiges of settlement met the untamed land, Silas Thorne had witnessed Jedediah Roth's public dismissal. Silas was a man who preferred the company of the wind and the silence of the plains to the chatter and scrutiny of the town. He came in for supplies, did his business with few words, and left. He knew Roth for a pompous fool, quick to judge and slow to kindness. He had seen the woman, her quiet composure, even as Roth had spewed his venom. He had seen her walk away, her shoulders straight, though he imagined her spirit was anything but. He was not a man given to meddling in others' affairs, his own life having taught him the bitterness of interference. Yet, something in her solitary figure, the way she faced the unforgiving landscape with a kind of desperate courage, resonated with a lonely chord within him. He had seen her find that small shelter amongst the rocks as darkness fell. Hours later, under the cold light of a partial moon, Silas made his way back towards where he had last seen her. He carried a canteen of water and a piece of dried meat wrapped in cloth. He moved with the quiet grace of a man accustomed to wild places. He found her huddled, small and still, and for a moment he thought she might have succumbed to the cold or despair. Then he saw the slight tremor that shook her frame. Ilara started violently when his shadow fell over her, her eyes, wide and fearful in the dim light, fixed on him. She scrambled back, pressing herself harder against the unyielding rock. Silas stopped a few paces away, holding out the canteen and the wrapped food. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but not unkind. "You need shelter and sustenance." He did not elaborate, did not pry. He simply stated a fact. Fear warred with a desperate, gnawing need within Ilara. This man was a stranger, appearing out of the darkness, After Roth's brutality, her trust in humanity was a shattered thing. Yet his eyes, shadowed by the brim of his hat, did not hold the contempt she had seen in Roth's, nor the leering curiosity of others. There was a weariness there, perhaps, a deep-seated quietness, and in his outstretched hand, an offering. The aroma of the dried meat, faint as it was, made her stomach clench with hunger. The thought of water was a torment. Who are you?" she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Name's Silas Thorne," he said. "Land out yonder is mine. Got a cabin. It's warm." He paused, then added, with a touch of gruffness that seemed to hide something softer, "No one should be out in this cold without a roof." Her mind raced. What choice did she have? To remain here was to invite slow decline, or worse. This man, this Silas Thorne, was an unknown, but Roth had been a known quantity who had revealed himself to be a monster. Perhaps the unknown was less perilous. She looked at the food, then back at his steady gaze. The flicker of intuition, a fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness of her despair, told her this was not a threat, but a lifeline, however precarious. With a trembling hand, she reached for the canteen. Her fingers brushed his, calloused and surprisingly warm. The acceptance was a monumental effort, a leap into an even greater unknown, but the alternative was no longer an option. Silas Thorne led her away from the cold indifference of the boulders, his silhouette a dark, steady presence against the moonlit landscape. The path to his cabin was little more than a game trail, winding through stunted trees and over uneven ground. Ilara stumbled often, her limbs stiff with cold and exhaustion, but Silas moved with an unhurried patience, occasionally pausing, as if sensing her need to catch her breath, though he said nothing. The silence between them was vast, filled only with the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the distant howl of a coyote, a lonely sound that echoed the desolation in Ilara's heart. The cabin, when they reached it, was small and unassuming, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a faint beacon in the wilderness. Inside, a low fire glowed in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the sparse furnishings. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves holding a few necessities. It was undeniably rustic, the dwelling of a man who lived a solitary life, yet there was an order to it, a cleanliness that spoke of self-respect. Compared to the open exposure of the rocks, it felt like a palace. Silas gestured towards the cot. "You can take that, I'll manage by the fire." He didn't wait for a reply, but turned to add another log to the hearth, his movements economical and precise. Ilara, overwhelmed and too weary to protest or question, sank onto the cot, the rough blanket he had indicated surprisingly comforting. The warmth from the fire began to seep into her chilled bones, a physical sensation so profound it almost brought fresh tears to her eyes. She ate the dried meat slowly, savoring each mouthful, and drank deeply from the canteen, the water tasting sweeter than any wine. He offered her a cup of hot, bitter coffee brewed over the flames, and she accepted it gratefully, the warmth spreading through her hands. The initial days in Silas Thorne's cabin were marked by a profound, observational silence. Ilara, still reeling from her public humiliation and the harshness of her circumstances, remained wary, watchful. She did not know what she expected. Condescension, demands, cruelty, but Silas offered none of these. He moved about his small domain with a quiet self-sufficiency, tending to his few animals, a couple of goats, some chickens, mending his tools, or disappearing for hours into the wilderness, presumably to hunt or check traps, always returning with something for the pot. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were direct, functional. "Wood's by the door. Stew'll be ready soon." Slowly, hesitantly, Ilara began to emerge from her shell of shock and despair. The instinct to contribute, to earn her keep, was deeply ingrained. She started by tidying the already neat cabin, mending a tear in one of Silas's worn shirts with thread from her own small sewing kit. He said nothing when he noticed, but she thought she saw a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he looked away. She began to help with the cooking, her skills, learned in a dozen different kitchens during her unsettled life, transforming his basic fare into more palatable meals. She found a patch of workable earth near the cabin, and using a rusty spade she discovered, began to turn the soil. Nurturing a few wild herbs she recognized and some vegetable seeds she'd hoarded in her valise against a future that had, until now, seemed impossible. Trust was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, creeping dawn. It was built not on grand pronouncements, but on small, unspoken gestures. He would leave an extra, smoother piece of kindling near the hearth where she usually sat. She, in turn, ensured his coffee was always hot when he returned from the cold. He never questioned her presence, never alluded to the circumstances of her arrival. He simply accepted her, a silent, unassuming fixture in his solitary world. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his quiet demeanor, the slight easing of the lines around his eyes when a meal was particularly good, the way he would sometimes pause in his work and gaze out at the distant mountains, a profound loneliness etched on his face. He, in turn, observed her quiet resilience, the way she refused to be entirely broken, the gentle care she showed to the scrawny chickens or the struggling seedlings in her tiny garden. One evening, a storm blew in, the wind howling like a banshee around the small cabin, rain lashing against the single window pane. The fury of the elements seemed to break down some of the carefully constructed walls between them. Trapped inside, the silence felt different, charged with unspoken thoughts. Ilara was mending by the firelight, her fingers moving deftly when Silas finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Redemption Gulch ain't a place for soft landings." Ilara paused, her needle hovering. "No, Mr. Thorne, it is not." "Silas," he corrected quietly. After a moment he continued, "Roth is a fool and a coward." The unexpected defense, stark and unadorned, loosened something within Ilara. She found herself speaking, the words tumbling out, hesitant at first, then gaining a quiet momentum. She told him of her journey, of the hope she had carried, a hope not for riches, but for simple belonging, for a place where she would not be judged for the circumstances of her birth or the color of her skin. She spoke of a past filled with a quiet struggle for dignity, of losses that had shaped her but not defined her. She did not cry, but her voice was thick with the weight of unshed tears. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the fire, his hands resting on his knees. When she finished, a long silence filled the cabin, broken only by the howl of the wind. Then he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "This land, it don't care about a person's bloodline or what folks in parlors whisper. It asks for strength, honesty. It's people. People bring the ugliness with them." He shifted, his gaze meeting hers, direct and unwavering. "I've known my share of judgment, for different reasons maybe, but judgment stings the same no matter the cause." He didn't elaborate on his own past, but the shared admission of pain, of being an outsider, forged a new, deeper connection between them, a fragile bridge of empathy built in the heart of the storm. It was not absolution, not yet, but it was understanding, a rare and precious commodity. Months unfurled, measured by the slow turn of the seasons across the harsh, beautiful land. A fragile normalcy took root in the small cabin on the outskirts of Redemption Gulch. The rhythms of their shared existence became familiar, comforting. Ilara's small garden, coaxed from the reluctant earth, began to yield a meager but welcome bounty of greens and roots. The scent of her baking, a skill she had carefully cultivated, sometimes mingled with the wood smoke from the chimney, a subtle announcement of a domesticity that had quietly, unexpectedly, bloomed in the wilderness. Silas, though still a man of few words, seemed less guarded. Occasionally, a dry, almost imperceptible humor would touch the corner of his lips at something she said or did. Ilara found herself humming as she worked, a sound she had thought long buried beneath layers of hardship. The constant knot of anxiety in her stomach had loosened, replaced by a tentative sense of peace, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost alarming. This quiet sanctuary, however, could not remain entirely untouched by the world beyond their small patch of land. On Silas's infrequent trips into Redemption Gulch for supplies, he felt the curious, sometimes hostile stares. Whispers followed him, insinuations about the dark woman living in his cabin. Jedediah Roth, his pride still smarting, his petty cruelty finding fertile ground in the town's prejudices, had not been idle. He painted Ilara as an adventuress, a woman of loose morals, and Silas as a fool, or worse, a man deliberately flouting the town's unwritten codes. One afternoon, the intrusion came directly to their door. 3 figures approached the cabin. The town's self-righteous preacher, Mr. Hemlock, his face a mask of stern disapproval. Martha Gable, a woman whose piety was matched only by her appetite for gossip. And, lingering slightly behind them, a nervous-looking man, Ilara, recognized as the town's reluctant constable, Mr. Tibbs. Silas, who had been chopping wood, straightened as they approached, his axe still in hand, his stance instantly wary. Ilara, alerted by the change in his posture, stepped to the doorway of the cabin, her heart sinking. "Mr. Thorne," Preacher Hemlock began, his voice unctuous, "we have come on a matter of some concern to the community. It has been brought to our attention that you are cohabiting with this woman." He gestured towards Ilara with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Martha Gable chimed in, her voice sharp. "It ain't decent, Silas Thorne. A man living alone with a woman of her sort, with no marriage lines, no sanction from God or man. It sets a bad example. People are talking." Ilara felt a familiar flush of shame and anger, but she held her tongue, looking to Silas. His face was like granite, his eyes narrowed. He shifted his grip on the axe, not menacingly, but with a quiet assertion of his ground. "This is my land," Silas stated, his voice low and steady, carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "Who I choose to have in my home is my business." "It becomes the town's business, Thorne," Hemlock countered, puffing himself up, "when it offends public morality. There are standards, decency. This arrangement is an affront." He looked pointedly at Ilara. Perhaps the woman should be encouraged to move on. For her own good, of course. And for the good of Redemption Gulch. A cold fury, protective and absolute, settled in Silas's eyes. He took a step forward, and the 3 visitors instinctively recoiled. "Ilara stays," he said, each word a chip of ice. He looked directly at Hemlock, then at Gable, his gaze unwavering. "She is under my protection. This is her home now." He paused then, with a decisiveness that stunned Ilara and silenced the delegation. He added, his voice ringing with an undeniable finality, "She is my wife." The lie, or perhaps the premature truth, hung in the air, audacious and irrefutable. Preacher Hemlock's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with impotent rage. Martha Gable gasped, clutching her shawl. Even Constable Tibbs looked surprised, then strangely relieved. There was little they could say to a man claiming a woman as his wife, however unconventional the circumstances or sudden the pronouncement. Without another word, Silas turned his back on them and resumed chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a clear dismissal. The delegation, their purpose thwarted, their authority challenged, exchanged uncomfortable glances, and, after a moment of awkward silence, retreated back down the path, their mission a clear failure. Ilara watched them go, her heart pounding, a complex mix of gratitude, astonishment, and a strange, burgeoning warmth towards the man who had just publicly, unequivocally, claimed her. Silas's bold declaration, "She is my wife," echoed in the small cabin long after the officious delegation had retreated back to Redemption Gulch. It was a shield, expertly wielded, but it was also a spark, igniting a new, unspoken tension and awareness between them. The fragile normalcy they had cultivated was now overlaid with the weight of that public claim. Elara found herself looking at Silas differently, seeing not just a protector, but a man who had willingly bound his reputation to hers, however informally. Yet, the external pressures did not simply vanish. Roth, furious at being thwarted and publicly undermined by Silas's stand, became more venomous in his slanders. He began to whisper not just of immorality, but of theft, hinting that Elara had absconded with valuables intended for him, poisoning the well of public opinion further. He also began to subtly harass Silas, blocking access to a shared spring, disputing a long, uncontested boundary line of Silas's property. The significant threat materialized not as a direct attack initially, but as a slow, insidious constriction. Roth, using his modest influence and the town's ingrained prejudice, managed to convince a few other disgruntled settlers that Silas Thorne was an undesirable element. His defiance in harboring Elara a sign of a deeper contempt for community standards. They aimed to make his life, and by extension, Elara's, untenable. One morning, Silas found his small flock of chickens scattered, the coop door broken, several birds missing, likely stolen or killed. Another day, the path to the spring he used for his animals was deliberately blocked with felled trees, too heavy for one man to move easily. These were not mere pranks, they were calculated acts of aggression, designed to wear them down, to drive them out. Elara felt a rising tide of despair, not for herself this time, but for Silas. He had offered her sanctuary, and in return, she had brought this trouble to his door. "This is my fault, Silas," she said one evening, her voice heavy with guilt as they surveyed the damage to a section of his fence clearly cut. "If I had not come—" Silas stopped his work, turning to her, his face grim but resolute. "This ain't your fault, Elara. This is Roth's malice, and the town's fear. They fear what they don't understand." He looked at her then, a deep, searching look. "You think I regret offering you shelter?" She could not meet his eyes. "You have lost much because of me." "I've gained more than I've lost," he said quietly, a statement so unexpected, so profound in its simplicity, that it stole her breath. He did not elaborate, but the words hung between them, a testament to the unspoken bond that had grown in the face of adversity. This shared struggle, instead of driving them apart, forged their connection into something stronger, more resilient. Elara no longer felt like a passive recipient of his kindness. She was his partner in this siege. She began to actively help, her mind sharp and resourceful. She meticulously documented the damages, noted discrepancies in Roth's claims about the boundary lines by finding old survey markers Silas had forgotten. She learned to use a small hunting rifle Silas owned, practicing in secret until she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy, determined not to be a burden, but an asset. The crisis escalated when Roth, emboldened by the lack of direct confrontation from Silas, who preferred stoic endurance to open conflict, decided to force the issue. He gathered a handful of like-minded men, fueled by drink and self-righteousness, and declared his intention to inspect Silas's property for stolen goods, a clear pretext to intimidate and ransack. Word reached Silas and Elara through a young boy from town, son of the blacksmith, who sometimes traded small carvings for Elara's baked goods and had developed a shy affection for her gentle manner. "They're comin', Mr. Thorne," he'd whispered, eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Roth and his men, they got ropes." A cold dread settled over Elara, but alongside it, a fierce resolve. They had little time. Silas checked his rifle, his movements calm and deliberate. Elara, her face pale but her eyes steady, took up the smaller rifle. "They will not find us unprepared," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. They barricaded the door as best they could and waited, the silence in the cabin heavy with impending conflict. The shared fear was a palpable thing, but so was their shared determination. Silas looked at Elara, a long, searching gaze that spoke volumes. He reached out, his calloused hand briefly covering hers where it gripped the rifle stock. A silent promise, a confirmation of their unity. In that moment, the unspoken affection that had grown between them solidified into an unshakable commitment, a willingness to face whatever came, together. The hardships had stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their reliance on each other. The late afternoon sun cast long, ominous shadows as Roth and his 5 companions approached Silas Thorne's cabin. They were a motley crew, their courage bolstered by whiskey and a shared sense of grievance, albeit one largely manufactured by Roth's persistent agitation. Roth, at their head, carried himself with an air of arrogant authority, a length of rope coiled ostentatiously over his shoulder, a clear symbol of his intentions. They expected little resistance from the reclusive Thorne and the woman they considered little more than a squatter. Inside the cabin, Silas and Ilara stood ready, the heavy bar secured across the door. Through a small crack in the window shutter, Ilara watched them approach, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the rifle. Silas stood beside her, his own weapon held loosely but ready. The quiet of the wilderness was broken by Roth's belligerent shout. "Thorne, we know you're in there. We've come to reclaim what's mine, and to run this, Blight, off decent land." Silence from the cabin. This seemed to further embolden Roth. "You can't hide forever, Thorne. Open up, or we'll break the door down." Then Ilara's voice, clear and surprisingly strong, cut through the air. "Mr. Roth, you have no claim here. You have no right. You are trespassing." Roth, startled to hear her speak with such assertion, sneered. "The woman finds her tongue. It won't save you. We represent the decent folk of Redemption Gulch." It was then that Silas spoke, his voice a low growl that carried an unmistakable threat. "This is my property, Roth. You and your men take one more step towards this cabin, and you'll regret it. Turn around and leave." A few of Roth's men hesitated, unnerved by the conviction in Silas's tone. But Roth, his face flushed with anger and injured pride, spurred them on. "He's bluffing. It's one man and a woman. Get the door." As 2 of the men lunged forward, a shot rang out, not from Silas's rifle, but from Ilara's. She hadn't aimed at the men, but at the ground just in front of their feet, sending dust and gravel flying. The men stumbled back, shocked. The sound of the gunshot, sharp and definitive, cracked the tense atmosphere. Before Roth could react, Ilara spoke again, stepping out from the cabin door, which Silas unbarred, and opened just enough for her to emerge, Silas himself a formidable shadow just behind her. She held the rifle capably, no longer the frightened, rejected woman who had arrived in Redemption Gulch. Her gaze was fixed on Roth, unwavering and filled with a cold, righteous anger. "You judged me by the shade of my skin, Mr. Roth, not by the content of my character. You slandered me, humiliated me, and sought to drive me into destitution. Now you come to this man's home, a man who showed me the kindness you so clearly lack, and you seek to destroy what little peace we have found. What does your judgment, your cruelty, say of your own character, sir? What does it say of the decent folk you claim to represent?" Her words, delivered with a quiet passion and undeniable truth, resonated in the suddenly still air. Roth's followers shifted uncomfortably. They had come for a confrontation, perhaps a bit of rough justice, but not for a public dissection of their leaders, and by extension their own, moral failings. Silas stepped out fully then, standing beside Ilara, his rifle held at ease, but his presence a silent, powerful endorsement of her every word. Their united front was formidable, not just in arms, but in moral authority. Unseen by Roth's group, drawn by the sound of the earlier shot and the loud voices, a few other settlers had begun to gather at a safe distance. The blacksmith, Mr. Grayson, with his son, the storekeeper, Mr. Albright, who had always treated Silas fairly, even a few women from the town, curious and apprehensive. They had heard Ilara's words. They saw Roth's furious, contorted face and the quiet, dignified strength of Ilara and Silas. It was Mr. Grayson, the blacksmith, a man respected for his fairness and plain speaking, who broke the ensuing silence. "Roth," he called out, his voice carrying authority, "she speaks true. This ain't right. This ain't justice. This is just bullying. Leave them be." Another voice, then another, joined in. "Aye, Grayson's right. Go on home, Roth. You're making a fool of yourself." The tide was turning. Roth, seeing his support evaporate, his supposed moral high ground crumbling beneath him, looked around wildly. Even Constable Tibbs, who had arrived belatedly and uncertainly, seemed to find a measure of courage. "Mr. Roth," Tibbs said, his voice surprisingly firm, "these folks ain't done nothing provable against the law. You and your men need to disperse, now." The confrontation, which had promised violence, dissolved under the weight of public opinion and the undeniable courage of two people standing for their home and their dignity. Roth's bluster deflated. His companions, sensing the shift, began to melt away, unwilling to be associated with his now exposed vindictiveness. Roth himself, after a final glare of impotent fury at Ilara and Silas, turned and stalked off, defeated and humiliated, the coiled rope now a symbol of his own thwarted malice. The immediate aftermath of Roth's retreat was one of profound relief, mixed with a bone-deep exhaustion. Ilara felt the rifle grow heavy in her hands, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline receded. Silas gently took the weapon from her, his eyes, when they met hers, filled with a quiet pride and an unspoken tenderness that made her heart ache in a new, sweet way. The small crowd of onlookers, their intervention having tipped the scales, offered nods of respect, even a few murmurs of encouragement, before slowly dispersing, leaving Silas and Ilara in the quiet of their defended space. The threat, for now, had been neutralized. Jedediah Roth's power in Redemption Gulch, built on bluster and prejudice, had been significantly undermined by his public shaming. He would still be a resident, but his capacity to openly dictate morality or incite mob action was broken. In the days and weeks that followed, a new kind of stability began to settle over Silas Thorne's homestead, a stability earned not just by his declaration, but by their shared, courageous stand. The cabin, once merely a shelter from the storm of Ilara's initial despair, began to transform into a true home. Together, they repaired the fence Roth's cronies had damaged, their hands often brushing, their silences now comfortable, companionable. Silas, with Ilara's encouragement, cleared more of the land around the cabin, not just for practicality, but with an eye towards permanence. They planted a small fruit tree sapling, a fragile symbol of their hope for the future, its roots taking hold in the stubborn soil, much like their own. The community's perception, while not universally transformed, had undeniably shifted. Mr. Grayson, the blacksmith, made it a point to trade fairly with Silas for mending work, and his wife sent over a freshly baked pie with their son, an offering of neighborly goodwill. Mr. Albright, the storekeeper, greeted Ilara with a respectful nod when she occasionally accompanied Silas into town for essential supplies. The whispers did not entirely cease, but their venom was diluted, replaced in some quarters by a grudging admiration for their resilience. They were no longer just the reclusive man and the mysterious woman. They were Silas and Ilara, a couple who had faced down injustice and stood their ground. They had carved out a recognized existence, not through conformity, but through quiet integrity. For Ilara, the change was profound. The deep well of shame and fear that had haunted her for so long began to recede. In its place grew a quiet confidence, a sense of self-worth that was not dependent on the approval of others, but on her own inner strength and the unwavering respect she saw in Silas's eyes. She found a peace she had never known, a sense of belonging that was more real, more vital than any she had ever dared to dream of. Silas, too, was transformed. The harsh lines of loneliness around his eyes softened. He smiled more, a slow, rare unfolding that Ilara cherished. She had brought light and warmth into his solitary world, and he, in turn, had given her a place to heal, to grow, to simply be. Their found family was small, just the two of them against the vast indifference of the frontier, but its foundations were unshakable, built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and a love that had blossomed unexpectedly in the most unpromising soil. One evening, as they sat on the small porch Silas had recently added to the cabin, watching the sun dip below the rugged horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Silas turned to her. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. He did not have Roth's practiced words or grand pronouncements. His proposal, if it could be called that, was as simple and direct as the man himself. "Ilara," he said, his voice husky, "that preacher, Hemlock, he still owes us a proper service, if you're willing." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a deep, overflowing joy. "Yes, Silas," she whispered, "I am willing." Their life in Redemption Gulch would never be entirely easy. The land remained harsh, the winters long, and prejudice, though quieted, might still lurk in shadowed corners. But now they faced it together. Ilara, once the rejected mail-order bride, had found not just a husband, but a partner, a protector, and a love that was true and steadfast. She had become a woman of resilience and quiet strength, her spirit unbowed, her heart finally home. Sometimes she would tend to the small grave of a traveler's child left on the edge of town, a quiet act of compassion that spoke volumes of her own journey from desolation to a hard-won grace. The legacy they were building was not one of wealth or status, but of courage, kindness, and the enduring power of human connection in a world that often offered little of either. As the last sliver of sun vanished, casting the landscape in a soft, purple twilight, Ilara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. The small cabin, their fortress and their sanctuary, glowed with the warm light from within. The fruit tree saplings stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, a testament to their shared future. The wind still whispered through the vastness, but now it carried not just the scent of dust and sage, but the promise of tomorrow, a tomorrow they would face, hand in hand, their unconventional love, a quiet beacon in the unforgiving, beautiful land. She was no longer defined by a cruel rejection, but by the profound acceptance and fierce love she had found in the heart of an unexpected man, in a place that had, against all odds, finally offered a measure of true redemption.